Struggling to reach the hundreds of thousands of people affected along the country's northeastern coast, authorities are now worried about the threat posed by the country's nuclear power plants, some of which were damaged in the quake. The focus has turned to the Fukushima No. 1 plant, where a massive explosion took place, resulting in many injuries. Officials said the blast sent a ceiling crashing down and destroyed a wall. The incident was enough to force Japanese officials to warn of a meltdown. Authorities have already evacuated thousands of people living around the plant, and later in the day, Japan's chief cabinet secretary confirmed everyone's worst fears when he announced that radiation had started leaking out of the complex. People living in the prefecture were told to close doors, shut windows, and cover their mouths with masks or wet towels. Authorities have banned people from traveling towards the affected area, saying the situation was too dangerous. Further north in Miyagi Prefecture, rescuers and survivors are trying to pick up the pieces and rebuild. For the hundreds of thousands of survivors, life is a struggle. Yesterday's trauma was centered off the Miyagi coast, and one of the worst-hit places was the city of Sendai, where a huge tsunami swept away cars, boats, planes, and even houses. Running water is scarce, food is in short supply, power has been disrupted, while getting around is difficult because of the damage to roads. Long lines formed outside of convenience stores, with people desperate for clean water and food. Survivors have had to use the internet to stay in touch with their loved ones, with telephone and mobile phone networks proving unreliable. Those who are not bunkered down at home have left for government shelters. Hospitals have been overwhelmed as they struggle to treat the flood of casualties. Rescue efforts have been pampered by the extensive damage to infrastructure, while parts of Miyagi are still underwater. Many are also feared trapped under the rubble of toppled buildings. Authorities warn the death toll will rise given the scale of the disaster, with reports of new tremors and tsunamis today and the threat of an atomic meltdown looming large. There is a real sinking feeling that Japan's terrible ordeal is far from over. Elmi Long, TVB News, Sendai, Japan.
Well, Elmi Long joins us now live from Sendai. Elmi, what's the latest there? What can you tell us, latest developments?
Well, yes, I'm at a hotel here in Sendai, and just before 7 p.m. Hong Kong time, we experienced a minor aftershock here, and the chandeliers in the lobby behind me here were shaking. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that some of the hotels have closed and asked their guests to stay at government shelters, and we visited one of those government shelters this afternoon. And apart from people queuing up to get their hands on payphones because the mobile phone services are really poor here, many more were actually lining up to get their hands on instant noodles because supermarkets and convenience stores remain closed. Now, that's all from me here in Sendai. Back to the Hong Kong studio.
Elmi, thank you very much for reporting from Sendai there. Stay safe. Operators of the Daya Bay nuclear power plant say the facility in Shenzhen was not affected by yesterday's earthquake. Meanwhile, mainland authorities are monitoring the impact of the radiation leak at the Fukushima No. 1 plant. The Deputy Chief of Environmental Protection said in Beijing today the problem does not pose any danger to the country at the moment. Well, Tokyo woke up to transport chaos this morning. All railway services were suspended in the Tokyo metropolitan area, and as the tremor hit, forcing thousands to spend the night in hotels, offices or refuge centers. Hundreds of passengers were stranded at Haneda Airport as flights were cancelled or diverted. Office workers trying to make their way home stopped in front of a giant screen at Shimbashi Station to watch the news. Some commuter rail lines resumed services this morning, but there's still a major gridlock at rail, road and air terminals. The government has asked people to evacuate to safe areas such as office buildings and advised them not to return home if roads were still impassable. The Transport Ministry said all highways from Tokyo leading to the quake-hit areas were closed except for emergency vehicles. Mobile communications have been interrupted and calls to the devastated areas were going unanswered. Japan is probably one of the best prepared countries in the world to deal with earthquakes. But this man said things rarely go as planned in an earthquake situation. Even with all the manuals and the training, he said, when the quake hits, your brain cannot function that much. While the capital was spared the worst effects of the quake and subsequent tsunami, tall buildings swayed dramatically, sending people rushing into the streets.
At the time, it was terrifying. I've never felt a quake that strong. But, you know, my Japanese co-workers haven't experienced anything like this either in their lifetime.
Elsewhere along Japan's Pacific coast, people woke up this morning to widespread devastation. Here in the country's north, houses and buildings lay broken and rubble washed ashore by the tsunami lay on top of everything. The scenes of devastation were being repeated all along the coast, and even to a nation accustomed to earthquakes, the extent of the damage was shocking. Before leaving to visit some of the worst-hit areas this morning, Prime Minister Naoto Kan said emergency services had been working around the clock to assist all the victims.
While yesterday's earthquake devastated large parts of Japan, most other nations and regions around the Pacific escaped the worst of the disaster. Countries around the world have pledged to do what they can to help Japan recover from its worst quake on record. Tony Sabine has that story.
As Japan picks up the pieces from yesterday's devastating earthquake, other countries breathed a sigh of relief that they were spared the worst of nature's wrath. When the quake hit early yesterday afternoon, tsunami alerts were issued in countries and regions up and down the Pacific Rim, raising fears of a repeat of the Indian Ocean disaster in December 2004 that killed hundreds of thousands of people. From Pacific island nations like New Zealand to Chile and Peru in South America, as well as the US states of California, Oregon, Washington and Hawaii, authorities ordered people to leave low-lying areas and take refuge on higher ground. But by the early hours of this morning, many of them had lowered their alerts, confident they were in the clear. Despite the power of the earthquake, many nations and regions around the Pacific reported minimal damage. Attention has now turned to helping Japan recover from its most powerful earthquake on record, and nations around the globe have pledged their support, including one of Tokyo's closest allies, the United States.
We currently have an aircraft carrier in Japan, and another is on its way. We also have a ship en route to the Marianas Islands to assist as needed. My understanding is that the main assistance that we're going to be able to provide them is lift capacity, the ability for us to, I think, help in the cleanup. You have huge disruptions, both in the infrastructure. You have boats and houses and cars that are washed into main thoroughfares, and that requires heavy equipment.
Another country pledging support is New Zealand, which is still recovering from last month's deadly earthquake in Christchurch.
We want to offer whatever support we can. Obviously, we're conscious of the fact that we're dealing with our own crisis in Christchurch.
Kay said a rescue team of 48 was on the way to Japan, while other countries have also promised to send rescuers food, clothing, medicines and equipment. Tony Sabine, TVB News.
The Immigration Department has received more than 500 calls for help involving Hong Kong people in Japan. And while some travel agencies have cancelled their tours, some visitors were still setting off for the quake-hit country today. Andrew Lau reports.
Travelers returning to Hong Kong from Japan said the airports in Tokyo and Osaka remained orderly despite some delays. But getting around Tokyo was a problem.
The train was suspended. We have to walk from the station to my hotel. We spent 2 hours time.
It took this man 18 hours to get onto a flight at Narita Airport.
The first night when we arrived, because everybody is in the downstairs, because they said because of the construction, it may be very dangerous on the upstairs.
And Hong Kong holiday makers setting off for Hokkaido this morning weren't exactly sure if it was a good idea. The tour guide insisted that Hokkaido has not been affected. This traveler said they were still going there because the travel